I told my new wife I was just the caretaker at the property. I let her believe I fixed the fences, kept the heat running, and answered to someone else. What I never told her was that I owned the 42 acres she was standing on. The farmhouse, the barn, the equipment shed, and the rental cottage at the end of the gravel drive. I thank God every single day I kept that to myself, because 4 days after we said our vows, she sat down at my kitchen table with a real estate attorney and started asking questions about the title. Stay with me until the end of this. And when you're done, tell me where you're listening from. I want to know how far a story like this can travel. My name is Ed. I turned 67 last March. I've spent my working life in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and most of that life has been tied to land. I started at 19 hauling hay for a cattle operation outside Staunton. By 26, I'd saved enough to lease a small parcel and run a few beef cattle of my own. I wasn't educated. I wasn't connected. I just showed up before sunrise every day and did what needed doing. By the time I was 45, I'd bought out the original operation. The owner was retiring. His kids wanted nothing to do with it, and I got it at a price that would seem impossible now. Over the next 2 decades, I added the adjacent parcels as they came available. 42 acres total. A working farm with a farmhouse I'd renovated room by room over 30 years, a restored bank barn, and a rental cottage I'd built myself from a kit I ordered out of a catalog in 1998. My wife, June, my first wife, the real one, she was beside me through all of it. She kept the books, managed the cottage rentals, made sure the taxes were paid and the insurance didn't lapse. We were married for 31 years. She died of ovarian cancer 4 years ago this coming October. I held her hand at the end. I drove home alone and sat in the dark in the kitchen for 3 hours before I could make myself get up and feed the animals. For 2 years after that, I didn't think about meeting anyone. My daughter, who lives up in Harrisonburg with her husband and my 2 grandkids, kept telling me I needed to get out of the house. Stop talking to the cattle, Dad. Call somebody. Go somewhere. I told her I was managing. I wasn't managing particularly well, but I wasn't ready to say that out loud. Then I went to a fall harvest dinner at the Methodist Church in Waynesboro. Somebody had organized it as a community thing, open to anyone, and I went mostly because my neighbor Earl had shamed me into it. Said I'd been alone long enough, and the green bean casserole alone was worth the drive. That's where I met Connie. She was 53, dark hair with some gray coming in, and she had a way of laughing that made the room feel warmer. Said she'd just moved to the area from Roanoke after a divorce. Worked as a bookkeeper for a small landscaping company. Nothing glamorous, she said, just steady. She had a nephew named Tanner who was 21 and living with her temporarily while he sorted out his next step. Between jobs, she said, figuring himself out. When she asked what I did, I told her the truth, or most of it. I said I worked on a farm outside of town, kept the place running, maintained the equipment, handled the livestock. All of that was accurate. I just didn't mention that the farm was mine. I hadn't planned to lie. It came out of a habit I'd developed after what happened with a woman I'd met about a year after June passed. Her name isn't worth repeating. We'd gone on 4 or 5 dates, and when I mentioned the property offhand, she asked in the very next breath whether I'd ever thought about selling and what I figured it might be worth. The dinner ended fine, but I drove home feeling like I'd been appraised instead of courted. I ended it that week, told her I wasn't ready. That was partly true. After that, I made a decision. I was just Ed the farm worker until I knew better. Connie didn't seem to care one way or the other about money. She drove an old Subaru Forester with a cracked rear bumper and seemed perfectly satisfied with it. She brought homemade soup to the farm on cold afternoons, and we'd sit on the porch and watch the ridgeline go purple at dusk. She never asked what the land was worth, never asked about savings or retirement. She seemed to like me, and that felt like enough. Tanner came around occasionally. Quiet kid, or so I thought at first. Polite when he needed to be, distant when he didn't. I figured he was just uncomfortable with his aunt's new situation. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I'd known kids who needed time. After 8 months, I asked Connie to marry me. We were sitting on the porch on a Sunday evening in September, and it felt right. She pressed both hands against her face and said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. Said she hadn't felt this safe in years. My daughter drove down the following weekend. She sat with Connie at the kitchen table, and they talked for 2 hours while I was out doing chores. When I came back in, My daughter pulled me aside and said, "She seems kind, Dad. I just want you to be sure." There was something in her face she wasn't saying. I told her I was sure. She nodded slowly and let it go. We had a small ceremony in mid-October, held it right here on the farm, under the big maple at the edge of the yard that June had planted 30-some years ago. My son-in-law took photos. My grandkids ran around in the grass. My neighbor Earl stood up with me. Connie's sister flew in from Charlotte, a woman named Rita I'd only met once before. She was warm enough. Tanner wore a blue blazer and checked his phone throughout. My farm manager, a man named Pete who's worked this place with me for 14 years, pulled me aside the night before the ceremony. He said, "Ed, I've been with you a long time. I just want to ask once. You sure about this?" I told him I appreciated it and that I was. He shook my hand and didn't say anything else, but he held my hand a beat longer than normal. The ceremony was brief. The reception was just dinner in the barn. Connie cried during the vows, and I believed every tear. That first night, we stayed in the farmhouse. It's a real house. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen we'd renovated in 2014. But it's a farmhouse. It smells like old wood and wood smoke, and there's a mudroom off the back that always has boots in it. Connie walked through it slowly after dinner, and I noticed her looking at things. The original plank floors, the low ceilings in the back rooms, the windows that rattle a little in the wind. She said it had a lot of character. The second day was quiet. We had breakfast. She was warm, funny, the same as she'd always been. I thought I'd imagined the way she'd looked at the house. The third day, I drove to the hardware store in the early afternoon. I was gone maybe an hour and 20 minutes. When I came back, Connie was sitting at the kitchen table with a man I'd never seen before. He had a briefcase. He was writing on a yellow legal pad. Tanner was leaning against the counter with a coffee mug like he lived there. I stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone looked up. Connie saw me first. Her face shifted into something I hadn't seen before. Not quite warm, not quite cold. Practiced. "Ed, sit down. There's something we need to go over." The man with the legal pad introduced himself as a family law attorney from Staunton. Said Connie had reached out to him the week prior to understand her rights as a new spouse in Virginia. I looked at her. The week prior, she folded her hands on the table. She said she didn't want to start our marriage without getting some things clarified. She said Virginia was an equitable distribution state, which meant that what we acquired during the marriage would be divided fairly in any dissolution. She said she wanted to understand what I brought to the marriage so that her interests were protected going forward. I said, "Connie, we've been married 3 days." She said she knew that. She said she was just being practical. Tanner set his coffee mug down. He said, "This is just paperwork, Ed. It's not personal." I asked him why he was in this conversation at all. He said, "I'm here for my aunt, the attorney. I'll call him the attorney. I have no reason to protect his name." Said he'd drawn up a document that would formalize a financial disclosure. He wanted me to list my assets, all of them. I looked at the document. It had blanks for property, retirement accounts, business interests, liquid assets. I said I'd need to speak with my own attorney before signing anything. Connie's expression didn't change. She said she'd hoped we could handle this between us. That involving lawyers would make things complicated. Tanner stepped away from the counter. He was taller than me by several inches and broader. He'd been thin and unassuming the few times I'd seen him before. Standing there in my kitchen, he seemed like a different person. He said, "Ed, she gave up her apartment, her job, her whole life in Roanoke. She's your wife now. She has a right to know what she married into." I said that was between me and my wife, not her nephew. He leaned forward just slightly, not threatening, just present in a way that was meant to be noticed. He said, "We just want this to be easy." I stood up and said I needed to get back to the animals. I said we'd talk more that evening. I walked out the back door and went straight to Pete's truck in the equipment shed. I knocked on the window. He rolled it down. I told him what had just happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat quiet for a moment and said, "My wife saw Tanner in town last Tuesday. He was at the county assessor's office asking about property records on this parcel." I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic. Something colder than that. That night I called my daughter. She already knew something was wrong, because she'd been thinking about the wedding since she left. She said that at the reception, she'd gone to find the bathroom and taken a wrong turn into the equipment shed. Rita and Tanner were in there talking. She'd heard Tanner say, "The caretaker thing is perfect. She has no idea how much this place is worth." Rita had laughed. My daughter had stood in the dark for a moment and then walked back to the party and spent the rest of the evening smiling and trying to figure out what she'd just heard. She said, "Dad, I should have told you that night." "I'm so sorry," I said. "Sweetheart, I'm glad you're telling me now." She started to cry. I told her to stop. I said it wasn't her fault. Said I needed her help. The next morning I drove to Staunton and met with a private investigator named Pat Caldwell, who'd come recommended through my son-in-law's brother, who worked in law enforcement. I laid out everything I knew about Connie, Tanner, and Rita. Pat called me 5 days later and told me to sit down. Connie's real name wasn't Connie Marsh. It was Beverly Ostrowski. No record of her living in Roanoke. Her most recent verifiable address was in Knoxville, Tennessee. Tanner was not her nephew. He was the son of a man she'd been in a relationship with for years. Not a blood relative, but a long-term partner in what Pat called a coordinated scheme. Rita was her actual sister, the one true piece of her story. And she had a prior conviction for fraud in Georgia from 2017 that had been pleaded down to misdemeanor deception. In the past 7 years, Beverly Ostrowski had married 3 men, all widowers, all over 60, all with real property, one in western North Carolina, one in eastern Tennessee, one in southern Ohio. The North Carolina man had signed over a timber easement worth north of $100,000 before he understood what had happened. The Ohio man had drained a retirement account into a joint account that she'd emptied within days of him doing so. The Tennessee man had fought back, and the situation had escalated. Tanner had shown up at his home, and the man had ended up with a broken wrist, which he'd reported to police, though by then Beverly was gone, and Tanner had an alibi that didn't hold up under later scrutiny, but was never successfully challenged. I held the phone for a long time after Pat finished talking. I thought about my wife June. I thought about the barn we'd built together. I thought about the maple tree under which I'd just stood and said vows I meant to a woman who had planned every word of her response. I told Pat I wanted more than enough to end this. I wanted it so airtight that no attorney in Virginia could wiggle out of it. Pat said she understood. She said she'd been waiting for a case like this for a while. The morning after I got Pat's report, Connie came to me with new demands. She said she'd looked into Virginia property law. She said as my spouse she was entitled to occupy the marital home, and that she wanted my name and hers on a joint bank account by the end of the week. She said she'd also been speaking with a property management company in Staunton about the rental cottage, and that she thought we should move it to a different rental platform to maximize income. She said all of this calmly, over coffee, like she was reading from a grocery list. I said I'd been thinking about whether to retire. Her eyes moved in a way I'd learned to read by then. Alert, interested. I said Pete had mentioned that if I stepped back from day-to-day operations, the farm's corporate structure might offer a buyout of my employment contract. I said it might be as much as $70,000 or $80,000. She set her mug down. She said, "That's a start. What about the retirement accounts?" I said I had an IRA and a SEP that together were probably around $200,000. She nodded slowly. She said, "That's something we should be consolidating." Tanner materialized in the doorway. He always seemed to appear right at the moment money came up, like he had a sensor for it. He said, "You two getting on the same page?" Connie said, "Almost." She looked at me and her voice went quieter. "Ed, I moved here for you. I left my life. I need to know you're taking this seriously. I need to feel secure." I said I understood. She said, "Then let's go to the bank this week, together, and let's talk to someone about putting the property in both names." Tanner leaned against the doorframe. He said, "That's just being smart. That's what married people do." I said I'd need a few days to get things organized on my end. That afternoon I met with Pete, Pat, my daughter and son-in-law, and a man named Alan Greer, an assistant Commonwealth's attorney in Augusta County, who'd been brought in by Pat through a contact she trusted. Alan had prosecuted financial exploitation cases for 11 years. He looked at Pat's report and the recordings from the kitchen. I had a home security system installed throughout the farmhouse, with posted notices at every entrance as required by Virginia law, and had it for 4 years, and he said he had enough for charges right now. Identity fraud, conspiracy, financial exploitation of an older adult, which in Virginia carried enhanced penalties. I said I wanted more. I said I wanted them on record making explicit demands in front of a witness. Alan said he understood, but he wanted me to be careful. He said these people had a pattern of escalation and that the Tennessee situation hadn't ended well. He didn't want me taking unnecessary risks. I said I had a plan, and I walked him through it. We set it up for the following Thursday. I told Connie that the farm's managing partner, I said the farm was structured as an LLC, and that I answered to a silent partner, had agreed to a meeting about my retirement package. I said he wanted to meet her too, since as my spouse she might need to sign some paperwork related to my housing situation, since the farmhouse was technically tied to my employment. She said Tanner was coming. I said of course. Pete would play the role of the managing partner. He'd done enough business in his life that he could hold a table. Alan would be 2 miles down the road in a car with 2 Augusta County Sheriff's deputies and Pat's assistant monitoring the security feed from a laptop. Thursday came in cold and gray, a hard October sky. I'd built a fire in the living room fireplace to make it feel normal. Pete arrived at 2 o'clock in his good jacket and sat at the head of the kitchen table. He had a folder of documents in front of him that meant nothing but looked official. Connie and Tanner arrived from down the hall together. The first 20 minutes were careful and measured. Pete laid out a fictional retirement package, $65,000, contingent on a 60-day notice period, and Pete taking over the caretaker role with a reduced formal title. Connie asked smart questions. She wanted to know about tax withholding, about the payout timeline, about whether it could be structured as multiple installments. She was good. I'll give her that. This was not her first time at a table like this. Then Pete said there was a complication. He said the farmhouse was employer-provided housing tied to my employment contract. He said upon my separation from the LLC, my occupancy rights would terminate within 60 days. Connie's face went still. She said, "We're married. This is our home." Pete said that the property was held in the LLC and had never been a marital home in the legal sense, since the marriage post-dated the employment arrangement. She said she was aware of her rights in Virginia. Tanner leaned forward. He said, "Equitable distribution applies to the marital home. You can't just remove her from the property by calling it an employment arrangement." Pete said he wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't offering legal advice, but that the LLC's position was clear. Tanner stood up. He was calm in a way I'd seen before, the kind of calm that isn't really calm at all but is something coiled up underneath. He said, "Let me explain how this is going to work. My aunt uprooted her entire life to be with this man. She married him. Virginia law is on her side. If your LLC tries to push her out of this property, we will tie this place up in litigation for years. We will make this farm impossible to operate, impossible to sell, and impossible to transfer. We have people who know how to do that." Pete said he understood. Tanner said, "I don't think you do." He turned to me. "Ed, you need to tell him to back down. You need to tell him you want to retire, collect your package, and then you and Connie are going to sit down with a real estate attorney and get this property transferred into joint ownership. That's what's happening," I said. "Tanner, I don't think." He cut me off. He said, "I'm not asking you." He pointed at Pete. "Tell your boss that his caretaker is about to become a very expensive problem if he doesn't get out of the way." Connie put her hand on the table. She didn't touch anyone. She just placed her hand there, flat, and said quietly, "Ed, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I've done it both ways. The easy way is better for everyone, especially for men your age who are alone out here and don't have a lot of people watching out for them." The room was very quiet. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about June. I thought about 31 years and a maple tree and 2 hands held at the end. Then the front door opened. 2 Augusta County Sheriff's deputies came in through the mudroom. Pat's assistant was behind them. Alan Greer followed. Tanner moved toward the back door. He made it to the mudroom before the second deputy caught up with him. He swung once. The deputy was ready for it. Tanner went down on the brick floor and didn't get up on his own. Connie didn't run. She stood at the table and looked at me, and I saw it clearly for the first time, the thing she really was, underneath the soup and the Subaru and the laugh that filled up a room. It was cold and it was old, and it had been doing this for a long time. She said, "You set me up." I said, "You set yourself up. I just made sure the cameras were rolling." They put the cuffs on her in my kitchen. Rita was arrested at the Hampton Inn in Staunton 2 hours later, picked up by a different set of deputies based on Pat's tracking of her phone. The investigation moved through the fall. Pat's files went to the Commonwealth's attorney's office. The 3 prior victims were contacted. The North Carolina man, a retired forester named Clark, who was 74, came forward with documentation he'd been sitting on for 2 years because he thought no one would believe him. The Ohio man had moved to be closer to his kids and hadn't talked about what had happened to anyone except his son-in-law. The Tennessee man who'd had his wrist broken had filed a report that had gone nowhere but was now back in play. Clark testified at the trial. He was soft-spoken and precise, the way men who've worked in timber tend to be. He described the morning he'd signed the easement. He said he'd been confused about what he was signing, and Tanner had told him it was routine paperwork. He said he hadn't said a word to anyone for 14 months, because he was certain people would think he was a foolish old man who deserved what he got. I told him afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, that there was nothing foolish about being lonely and being lied to by someone who had practiced their lies for years. He looked at me for a moment, and then he shook my hand and said, "I appreciate you saying that." My attorney handled the annulment. Beverly Ostrowski had used a false identity on the marriage license, which rendered the marriage void from the start under Virginia law. There was never, in any legal sense, a Connie Marsh. The marriage did not exist. The farm had never been at risk in a direct legal sense, though the weeks before that became fully clear were not comfortable ones. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks. Beverly's attorney argued that she was a woman who'd been in difficult circumstances and had made poor choices while looking for security. The jury watched 71 minutes of kitchen footage from my home security system. They deliberated for under 5 hours. Beverly Ostrowski received 12 years. Tanner received 9, with the Tennessee assault factored in. Rita received 4 years for conspiracy. Clark and I have stayed in touch. He's back on his land in the mountains of western North Carolina. We talk on the phone about once a month. He's thinking about getting a dog. My daughter came down the weekend after sentencing with my son-in-law and the grandkids. We raked leaves and ate chili and played cards until late. At some point after the kids went to bed, she and I sat by the fire and she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said she could. She said, "Why did you never tell her the truth about the farm?" I thought about that for a while. I said, because I wanted to know if she'd stay around for a man who fixed fences and kept the heat running. I wanted to know if the man was enough before any of the rest of it came into the picture. She said, "And what did you learn?" I said I'd learned that hiding yourself to protect yourself was still hiding, and that you couldn't build anything real on a foundation of half-truths, even if the half-truth was meant to protect you. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. She said, "Mom would have known in a week." I said, "Your mother would have known before we left the parking lot of that church." She laughed. It was the best sound I'd heard in a long time. Later, after everyone was asleep, I walked out to the barn. The air was cold and clear, and the stars over the ridge were the kind you only see when there's no cloud cover and no moon to compete with them. I fed the last of the hay to the 2 older cows and stood in the quiet for a while. June would have had something to say about all of it, something dry and exact that would have made me laugh and feel foolish at the same time, in the good way. She would have seen Beverly Ostrowski for what she was inside of 15 minutes. She would have brought it up so gently, I wouldn't have felt defensive, just informed. I miss her every day. That part hasn't changed and I don't expect it to. But I'm all right. The farm is all right. The maple tree is still standing. I used a portion of what I'd set aside to start a small fund through the Augusta County Bar Association that helps older adults cover legal fees when they've been targeted by financial exploitation. It isn't much, but it's something. Alan Greer pointed me toward the right people to set it up. Pete said, "You sure you don't want to actually retire?" I said I'd retire when the work ran out. He said that could be a while. I said I knew. That evening I walked back up to the house as the sun went down behind the Blue Ridge. The light came in low and gold across the pasture, the way it does in October, the way it's done every October I've lived here, and it looked the same as it always has. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where all of it had played out, and I looked at the room, the plank floors, the window over the sink, the hook by the back door where June's old barn jacket still hangs because I've never been able to take it down. I thought about what I'd said to my daughter by the fire, about hiding yourself, about half-truths. Next time, if there's a next time, I'll lead with the whole picture. The farm, the acres, the work, all of it. And I'll trust that the right person will look at a man who smells like hay and spends his Saturdays fixing fence posts and decide that's exactly who she came to find. I drank my coffee until it was gone. Outside, the ridge went dark. The farm was quiet. That was enough.